I have spent 28 years working in contract law, not the dramatic courtroom variety that people imagine when they hear the word attorney, mostly transactional work, commercial contracts, the careful reading of documents to ensure that what parties believe they have agreed to matches what the document actually says, and the equally careful work of explaining the difference when it does not match. It is methodical work. It requires precision and patience, and a specific kind of attention that notices when language is vague where it should be specific, or specific where the specificity creates problems no one anticipated. I am good at it because I find genuine satisfaction in the gap between what people think they are agreeing to and what they have actually agreed to, and in the clarity that emerges when you read a document carefully enough that the gap becomes visible. This professional experience has, over 28 years, given me a very particular response to situations in which someone tells me I have agreed to something I have not agreed to. That response is not anger. It is not defensiveness. It is a quiet, focused interest in producing the document that establishes what was actually agreed to, and in reading that document carefully enough that the conversation becomes very short very quickly. People who deal in the assertion of rights they do not have generally rely on the other party not reading carefully enough. I read very carefully. I have done it professionally for 28 years. It is, to the extent that anything in the practice of contract law can be called fun, my primary source of professional enjoyment. My name is Richard Okafor. I am 55 years old. I am a partner at a mid-sized firm in Hargrove County, Virginia, and I live in Birchwood Manor, which is a 60-home HOA development about 14 miles from the city. I have lived there 7 years. My house is a 4-bedroom colonial with an attached 2-car garage that I converted to a 1-car garage and workshop when I moved in. I removed the second parking bay's automatic opener and installed a fixed workbench along the full rear wall, turning that half of the garage into a proper woodworking and home repair space that I use every weekend with the focused attention of someone who spends his working life at a desk and needs to make things with his hands to feel balanced. The remaining bay is where I park my car. The garage is mine. I designed the interior configuration. I paid for the conversion. It is, in every sense that matters, my garage. The HOA at Birchwood Manor had, until the events I am about to describe, been one of the better managed associations I had encountered as a resident. I had lived in 3 HOA communities over the years, and the range in governance quality is significant. I had seen boards that were essentially non-functional, boards that were effectively the personal domain of whoever showed up to enough meetings, and boards that were professional and procedurally sound. Birchwood Manor's board, for my first 5 years, was in the professionally sound category. Meetings were organized, decisions were documented, enforcement was consistent and fair, and the community functioned as a well-run shared residential environment should function. Then Joyce Parmalee was elected to the board. Joyce had lived in Birchwood Manor for 8 years when she joined the board in the 3rd year of my residence. She was a retired school administrator who had brought to neighborhood life the specific quality of energy that former administrators sometimes bring to volunteer positions, enormous, organized, and pointed in directions that the organization was not necessarily asking her to point it. She had opinions about parking. Specifically, she had developed, over the preceding 2 years, a comprehensive view that the parking situation in Birchwood Manor was inadequate, that residents with garage space were underutilizing it, and that the community's visitor parking, which consisted of 18 marked spots near the community center, was insufficient for the needs of a 60-home development. These observations were not entirely wrong. The visitor parking was sometimes full on weekend evenings when multiple households had gatherings simultaneously. People with garages did sometimes park in driveways and on the street rather than in their garages, leaving garage space technically empty. These were real conditions, and a board member noticing and thinking about them was not inherently problematic. What was problematic was the solution Joyce arrived at. At the September board meeting in the 2nd year of her board service, Joyce proposed a new community parking policy that she had drafted over the summer. I attended all board meetings. I considered it due diligence on the governance of a community I lived in and paid dues to, and I was there when she presented it. The policy was 22 pages, which was itself a signal that something unusual was happening, because well-drafted policies are generally concise, and the relationship between length and quality in policy documents is often inverse. I took a copy and read it that evening. The core of the policy was a provision, Section 7, subsection C, that stated the following, with the specific language that I am going to reproduce, because the specific language matters. Homeowners with attached or detached garages exceeding the minimum residential use requirement of one dedicated vehicle bay per licensed household driver shall make available to the community parking program any bay capacity in excess of the minimum requirement during community parking hours, defined as Friday through Sunday, 5:00 p.m. through 11:00 p.m. and Sunday through Thursday, 7:00 p.m. through 9:00 p.m. I read that language 3 times at my kitchen table. Then I read it again. Then I wrote the following notes in the margin of my copy, because that is what I do when I read documents. Minimum requirement, defined as 1 bay per licensed driver, 2 drivers in household, equals 1 bay per driver equals 2 bay garage fully allocated, 0 available for community use. 1 driver in household plus 2 bay garage equals 1 bay available for community use under this language. I lived alone. I had 1 licensed driver, me, in my household. I had a 2 bay garage, of which 1 bay was a converted workshop and 1 bay was a parking space. Under Joyce's proposed language, my garage's 2nd bay, my workshop, would be classified as available community parking during the specified hours. I put my pen down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I called my colleague Ellen Marsh, who practiced HOA law, and read her Section 7, subsection C. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Richard, that is a taking." I said I agreed. She said, "That is a proposed policy that, if adopted, would require you to make your private garage space available to other people's vehicles on a scheduled basis without your consent and without compensation." I said I was aware of that. She said it will not survive a legal challenge. I said I knew that too. I said I was going to address it at the board meeting first and reserve the legal challenge for after they adopted it, which I suspected they would, because Joyce had the energy of someone who had been working on this for months and had the board's procedural majority in her pocket. The September board meeting was one of the more interesting meetings I had attended in 7 years of HOA residency. I waited until Joyce had finished presenting her policy overview, then raised my hand and walked the board through Section 7, subsection C, with the specific attention I would bring to any contract provision that was going to be contested. I said the provision, as written, required single-driver homeowners with multi-bay garages to make their garage space available to community parking during specified hours without consent, without compensation, and without any mechanism for the homeowner to exclude sensitive or valuable items from a space that would be accessed by unknown visitors. I said this was a regulatory taking under Virginia property law and that the HOA lacked the authority to compel involuntary use of private property for community purposes. I said if the board adopted this provision, I would file for a declaratory judgment within 30 days. Joyce said the policy was designed to maximize community resources and that residents who were not using their garage space had an obligation to contribute it to the community. I said that was not how property law worked in Virginia or any other American jurisdiction. She said the HOA's covenants gave the board broad authority to establish community-wide policies. I said broad authority had limits, and one of those limits was that it did not extend to involuntary conscription of private property. And I suggested the board consult the HOA's attorney before voting. The board consulted the HOA's attorney. The attorney took 2 weeks and then provided a written opinion that said, with the specific precision of someone who had been asked an uncomfortable question and was answering it honestly, that Section 7, subsection C as drafted, would not survive a legal challenge under Virginia property law and recommended significant revision before any adoption vote. The board tabled the policy for revision. Joyce revised it. The revised version of Section 7, subsection C softened the mandatory language to a request that homeowners with available garage capacity consider participating in a community parking program on a voluntary basis. The word consider is not a legal obligation. A request is not a requirement. I reviewed the revised version and determined it was substantially harmless. It established a voluntary program that homeowners could join or ignore entirely without consequence. I said nothing at the meeting when the revised version was adopted because a voluntary program was not something I needed to oppose. I had no obligation to join it. I did not join it. Joyce was aware of this. She was also aware, because she was the kind of person who tracked these things, that my garage had a converted workshop bay that would, under her original formulation, have been classifiable as excess capacity. She had cited this specifically during the September meeting, before she understood I was going to challenge the provision, describing it as an example of underutilized garage space in the community. What happened in the following 3 months was the particular kind of escalation that occurs when a person with a strong conviction and a committee position cannot achieve their goal through official channels and begins looking for other mechanisms. Joyce did not accept the revision gracefully. She accepted it procedurally. She revised the policy. She moved the revision for adoption. She was professional at the meeting. And then she began doing things that were not official, but that used the proximity of her committee position as background radiation. She began telling neighbors that the community parking program was mandatory. Not in writing, she was too careful for that, but in conversation. I heard this from 3 different neighbors over the course of a month, each of whom had received some version of, the program is technically voluntary, but the board really expects everyone to participate in conversations with Joyce. 2 of them asked me if this was true. I said no, the program was voluntary and participation was entirely the homeowner's choice, and there was no consequence for non-participation. They seemed relieved. She submitted an architectural committee inquiry asking whether my garage conversion, the workshop bay, had been properly approved under the original conversion process. I pulled my conversion approval from my files, which was complete, properly signed, and on file with the HOA's management company, and responded to the inquiry with a copy of the approval documentation. The inquiry was closed. She put a notice on the community board, the physical bulletin board near the mailboxes, that said, "Community parking program participants needed. Garage owners with available space should contact Joyce Parmalee." I read this notice and said nothing because a bulletin board posting was not a binding legal instrument. Then, in February, she did something that crossed the line from aggressive advocacy to actual misrepresentation. My neighbor down the block, a retired engineer named Harold Weeks, came to my door one evening and said he had received a letter. He showed it to me. It was on paper with the Birchwood Manor HOA letterhead at the top, and it said that per the community parking program adopted by the board, residents with available garage capacity were required to register their availability with the program coordinator, Joyce Parmalee, and failure to register by a specified date would result in a compliance review. The letter was not signed by the board president, Tom Aldrich. It was signed by Joyce Parmalee, Community Parking Program Coordinator. I looked at the letterhead. I looked at the letter's content. I said, "Harold, did you get this through official HOA mail or directly from Joyce?" He said it had come through the mail in an envelope with the HOA's return address. I said I needed to make a call. I called Tom Aldrich that evening. Tom was the board president and was a reasonable man who had been managing Joyce's energy on the board for 2 years with the specific exhaustion of someone who had taken on a position intending to do moderate good and had discovered that one board member's vision of moderate good was considerably more intense than his own. I described the letter. Tom was quiet for a moment. He said he was not aware of that letter. He said he had not authorized it. He said the community parking program had been adopted as a voluntary program, and any letter describing participation as required was inconsistent with what the board had voted on. He said, "Richard, can you send me a scan of the letter?" I sent it within the hour. Tom called me back 40 minutes later and said he had spoken to Joyce and that she had described the letter as a routine program communication that had been misworded. He said he had told her to send a corrective communication to anyone who had received the letter clarifying that participation was voluntary. He sounded tired. I said I appreciated him addressing it quickly. Then I said, "Tom, this is not the first misrepresentation. I'm going to need to take formal action if there is another one." He said he understood. There was, 3 weeks later, another one. I came home on a Thursday evening to find a note on my garage door, not on my front door, on my garage door. The note said, "Your garage has been registered for community parking program participation beginning this Friday. Please ensure the side door is accessible during program hours. Thank you for your community contribution, J. Parmalee, Community Parking Coordinator." I stood in my driveway and read the note twice. Then I took a photograph of it, which captured the time and date in the metadata. Then I unlocked my garage door, went inside, went through the house to my office, opened my files, and pulled the HOA's founding documents, the Adopted Community Parking Program Policy, the September board meeting minutes, and my prior correspondence with Tom Aldrich. I read every document. I found nothing that gave Joyce Parmalee or the HOA any authority to register my garage for any program without my consent. The program was voluntary. Voluntary meant my consent was required. No one had asked for my consent. No one had received it. I went back to the garage. I looked at the workshop bay. I looked at the parking bay. I thought about what I was going to do. And then I thought about the fact that I had a conference in Charlotte the following week, a professional development conference I attended every year, 4 days of contract law updates and client networking, and that I had been planning to drive down Saturday and return the following Thursday. I thought about the note. I thought about Friday evening. I thought about what it would mean for Joyce's community parking program if the garage she had registered without consent was not accessible, not because I had locked it in anger, but because I was not home and I locked my garage when I left my property for any extended period, as any reasonable homeowner does. I called my neighbor across the street, a man named Dave Nguyen, who held my emergency house key and checked on my property when I traveled. I told Dave I was leaving Saturday for Charlotte and would be back Thursday. I asked him to hold any packages and make sure the front looked normal. He said, of course. I asked him not to give anyone access to my garage. He said he wouldn't. I said, "Dave, if anyone comes asking about my garage while I'm gone," he said, "Richard, I'll tell them you're away and I don't have access to the garage." I said that was exactly right. Then I went to the garage and locked it, both the automatic door and the manual side door. The side door got a keyed padlock through the hasp in addition to the standard lock, because the standard lock was older and I had been meaning to add the hasp for some time, and this seemed like a good occasion to do it. I also set the automatic door's manual release to the secured position, which prevented the door from being opened manually without the release cord inside the garage. Then I went upstairs and packed my bag for Charlotte. Saturday morning, I loaded the car, pulled out of the garage, locked everything, and drove to Charlotte. I did not know exactly what was going to happen while I was gone. I had a reasonably clear sense of what Joyce Parmalee was going to do when her Friday community parking program began and my registered garage was inaccessible. I thought about it on the drive to Charlotte with the mild anticipatory interest of someone who has read a contract carefully and knows what the document actually says and is waiting for the other party to discover this independently. Dave Nguyen called me on Sunday afternoon. HOA Karen declared my garage community parking. So I locked it up and disappeared for 2 weeks. Dave's call came on Sunday at 2:17 in the afternoon. He said, "Richard, I need to tell you what happened yesterday." I said, "Go ahead." He said Friday evening around 6, he had watched from his front window as a car he did not recognize pulled into my driveway and 2 people got out, a man and a woman, and walked to my garage door. They tried the automatic door, which did not open. They walked around to the side door. They tried the side door. They stood there for a moment, and then one of them, the woman, knocked on the front door of my house, which of course produced no response. Then she knocked on Dave's door. Dave said she introduced herself as Joyce Parmalee and explained that she was the community parking program coordinator and that my garage had been registered for the program, and she needed to ensure it was accessible. Dave said he had told her, as I had asked him to, that I was away and he did not have access to my garage. Joyce had then asked if he had a contact number for me. He said he did not give out neighbors' contact information. She asked if he knew when I would be back. He said he did not know my travel schedule. She said there had been a miscommunication with the program registration and it was important to reach me. Dave said he was sorry he could not be more help and closed his door. He said she had stood on the porch for a moment and then walked back to my driveway, looked at the garage, and left with the man she had come with. Dave said, "Richard, what exactly has she registered your garage for?" I gave him the short version. He said, "She registered your garage without asking you." I said she had left a note on the garage door informing me of the registration. He said, "That's a note, not consent." I said he had understood the situation precisely. I asked Dave if anyone else had come by after that. He said Saturday morning, a different car had parked in my driveway for about 10 minutes. A man he didn't recognize who had also tried the garage doors, looked at the side door padlock, taken a photograph on his phone and left. I asked Dave if the man had spoken to him. He said no. I thanked Dave and told him I would be back Thursday and that nothing about the situation required any action on his part. Then I called Tom Aldrich. Tom answered on the first ring, which told me he already knew something had happened. I said, "Tom, are you aware that Joyce left a note on my garage door informing me that it had been registered for the community parking program?" He said he was aware of it. I said, "You're also aware that I never consented to this registration and that the program is voluntary." He said he was aware of that too. He said he had spoken to Joyce after the Friday evening situation, and she had maintained that the registration had been based on a community needs assessment she had conducted and that single-occupant households with multi-bay garages had an implied obligation to participate. I said, "Tom, implied obligation and voluntary are opposites." He said, "I know that, Richard." He sounded considerably more tired than he had 3 weeks ago. I said, "Tom, I'm filing a formal complaint against Joyce with the HOA's management company when I return, and I'm advising the management company's counsel that her actions in this program administration have created potential HOA liability. I'm also consulting my own attorney about whether the note on my garage door, combined with the earlier letter to Harold Weeks, constitutes tortious interference with my property rights." He was quiet. I said, "I'm telling you in advance because I think you are a reasonable man who has been dealing with an unreasonable situation, and I want you to have the information before I act rather than after." He said he appreciated that and that he would be taking action at the board level before I returned. I hung up and returned to the conference, which had a good session on commercial lease dispute resolution that I found genuinely useful and which reminded me pleasantly that contract law, when practiced between parties who both understand that documents mean what they say, is a rational and productive activity. Tom was as good as his word. He called me Tuesday evening and said the board had held an emergency session that afternoon, which was procedurally unusual, but within the bylaws for urgent governance matters, at which Joyce had been presented with the compiled record of her community parking program communications, the original mandatory framing to neighbors, the letter to Harold, the bulletin board notice, and the garage door note. The board had voted to formally censure her for misrepresenting the program's mandatory nature and for registering a homeowner's property in the program without consent. The censure was a formal board action entered in the minutes. Joyce had been removed from the community parking program coordinator role. Tom said she had resigned from that role voluntarily when it became clear the censure motion was going to pass, which was a distinction without a practical difference from the outcome standpoint. He said the program itself was being administratively suspended, pending a full review of how it had been administered. I said I appreciated the board's action and that it addressed the immediate concern. I said I would still be filing the formal complaint when I returned because the documentation trail needed to be complete in the HOA's records regardless of the board's internal action. Tom said he understood and that the management company would receive me. He said, "Richard, I want to say something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "I've been on this board for 4 years. In 4 years, I have had some difficult situations. This is the most organized response to a governance problem I've ever seen from a resident." I said I was a contract lawyer and that organizing responses to governance problems was what I did professionally. He said, "Does it bother you that you have to do it for your own HOA?" I said it bothered me slightly, the way it bothers anyone to apply professional skill to a problem that should not exist. But I said I preferred the problem to exist and have a solution over it existing without one. I came home Thursday as planned. My garage was exactly as I had left it, locked, padlocked, undisturbed. Dave came across the street when he saw my car in the driveway and said, "Welcome back. Any further excitement?" I said I had heard it had been a notable week. He said, "That woman came back once more on Monday evening. She stood at your driveway for a while and then left." I thanked him for the observation. I filed the formal complaint Friday morning. It was 12 pages with attached exhibits, the original board meeting minutes showing the voluntary adoption, the September exchange, the revised policy text, the letter to Harold, the bulletin board notice, the garage door note, my phone records of the calls with Tom, and a timeline. The management company's representative, a woman named Carol Page, who had been administering the development for 6 years, read the complaint the same day and called me that afternoon. She said, "Mr. Okafor, this is thorough." I said I practiced contract law. She said, "I see. I also want you to know that I reviewed the community parking program file in our system and found that Mrs. Parmalee had entered 6 garages into the program's registration database without the owner's consent." I said that was important information. She said, "The board is being notified. We're sending correction letters to all 6 households and removing the entries." I said good and asked that all 6 households receive clear written confirmation that the program was voluntary and that their prior non-registration had created no obligation. Carol said she would ensure that happened. The formal complaint was reviewed by the board at the next regular meeting. I attended. Joyce Parmalee was also present, which was her right as a board member despite the censure, and she sat with the specific composure of someone who has been through a difficult week and has decided to be professionally present, even though professionally present was not an entirely comfortable condition. The board accepted the complaint, and the management company's findings, formally endorsed the correction letters to the 6 households, and added a provision to the community parking program policy, what remained of it after the administrative suspension, that explicitly stated the program was voluntary, that no registration could be entered without a signed consent form from the homeowner, and that any communication characterizing the program as mandatory was expressly prohibited. The board president read this provision aloud at the meeting, which I think was intentional rather than routine. I looked at Joyce while Tom read the consent requirement. She was looking at her notepad. She did not look up. I did not require her to look up. The document said what it said. The meeting moved on. What happened with Joyce Parmalee after that was the quiet resolution of a situation that had run out of room to continue. She remained on the board through the end of her term, which was 8 months after the formal complaint. She did not seek re-election. At her last meeting, she made a brief statement thanking the community for the opportunity to serve, which was gracious, and sat down. The board acknowledged her service, which was also gracious, and moved on to the next agenda item. She was not a bad person. She was a person who had gotten a fixed idea about a legitimate problem and had pursued it through means that were not legitimate and had run into the specific problem that this approach always runs into, which is a contract lawyer with a filing cabinet. I have been asked by people who have heard this story whether I felt bad about leaving my garage locked while Joyce was trying to access it. I have thought about how to answer that question honestly. The answer is no, but the reason matters. I did not feel bad because I was not doing anything wrong. I had not consented to the registration. The program was voluntary. My obligation was to open my garage to my own vehicles and my own use, which it was available for whenever I was home and needed it. My absence was genuine. I had a conference. I go every year. It was planned before any of this started. The locked garage during my absence was the ordinary condition of any responsible property owner who secures their home when they travel. The fact that it frustrated Joyce's unauthorized program registration was not a harm I had caused. It was a consequence she had created by registering my property without asking me. You cannot register other people's property in programs without their consent and then expect the property to cooperate with your schedule. Property is not cooperative by nature. Property is governed by documents and ownership, and the documents said I owned my garage, and the program said participation was voluntary, and I had not volunteered. The garage was available when I said it was available and locked when I said it was locked, and the only person who had a problem with that arrangement was the person who had decided she could override it by writing a note and entering a name in a database. She could not. She discovered this over the course of 1 week, during which the garage remained locked. The program remained without a compliant participant, and a 12-page formal complaint made its way through the management company's intake process with the methodical inevitability of a document that has been carefully prepared and contains no errors. I parked my car in the garage when I returned from Charlotte. The workshop was exactly as I had left it, the bench tools in their places, the projects I had been working on undisturbed, the shelving I had built along the south wall holding the organized stock of materials I kept for weekend projects. I walked through the space and noted that everything was in order. Then I went inside and made dinner and spent the evening the way I spend most Thursday evenings, which is quietly and without incident. The garage is mine. The workshop is mine. The car parks where it has always parked. The voluntary program has a consent form requirement and has produced exactly 3 voluntary participants in the 18 months since the revised policy was adopted, none of whom are me, all of whom joined because they genuinely wanted to contribute the space and found the arrangement convenient for their situations, which is exactly how a voluntary program is supposed to work. I check the HOA meeting minutes every month. I attend quarterly meetings. I read everything the management company sends and note anything that requires attention. The documents remain clear. The property remains mine. The workshop continues to produce things I build on weekends with my hands, which is the activity that keeps the work week's intensity from accumulating past the point of management, and which requires nothing from anyone except the raw materials, the tools, the space, and the uninterrupted Saturday morning to use all of them in peace. That is the space I protected. That is the space that was worth protecting. That is the space I came home to on Thursday evening and looked at and confirmed was exactly as I had left it, which was mine, which it has always been, which no one had the authority to change, and which the documents made clear in case anyone needed reminding. They needed reminding. I reminded them. Thumbnail text, *. She registered my garage. I registered it back.